That's right. So we do see a repeat of the opening from the first game. We mentioned it a couple of times. The opening is called the Grunfeld defense. This normally signifies that black is happy to let white have the center, but black is going to counterattack. And we see early on, if we bring up the analysis board, black has brought his queen into the game very, very early. We don't normally want to do this at home because the queen will get attacked. We saw in this position, white has the center. White controls the center, therefore black needs to play fast. You can't let your opponent control the midfield, the center of the board. You need to counterattack. Therefore, black gave a check. This is a check to the king. White blocked this check. There's 3 ways of dealing with the check. You either have to run away with your king, you have to block, or you have to capture the attacking piece. This time, white chose to block, attacking the white queen, and the queen enters the white camp. This is very controversial. I've actually studied this position myself. I prefer white. Black's queen, it looks very nice in the white camp, but later it will get kicked about. It will get attacked by white's bishop, or it will get attacked by white's rook.
Yeah, this is very much still opening preparation, and now Magnus is the one who has to recall his preparation. And
I completely agree. It's all about practice, whether that's playing through things on a board. I personally learned from the heat of battle. I like to play games. The feeling, the intimacy of that battle, it's that feeling which really kind of spurs me on.
And Magnus did remember he made a move, and Jan Nepomniachtchi answered, what's happening on the board now?
We could... I think the game is about to end, actually.
In a draw?
Yeah,
yes.
Prematurely with a repetition of moves. We were talking about space repetition, repeating things to remember. But this time, Jan Nepomniachtchi, he has the option to repeat the position for a 3rd time, but it hadn't. He got slightly confused about the placement of one piece.
And we have that move.
We have a move. It is a queen check. It's not the same queen check that we saw earlier, so it's a slightly different position, but it all depends. If Magnus Carlsen blocks with his bishop, Nepomniachtchi, he's got to decide where to put his queen now. If he puts it back from where it came from...
Oh, he's changed his mind. He's made a different move.
Okay.
Yes, we're going to have...
So we will have a fight.
David. Yes.
Yes.
He was really angry, and we're not... Wow.
Yeah,
Something really upset him, and we're not quite sure what it is. We will definitely try to get an interview after all the games they have finished and ask him about that. OK, we do have some moves.
That's right. So white has actually sacrificed a pawn. We see that one of white's pawns there on the left side has disappeared from the board. Black's queen is gone on an adventure. She's being greedy. She's grabbed a pawn there. And we see that black, actually, those pawns on the left side, black's pawns at the top of the board, they are unrivaled. They are unmatched. Those pawns later will be a huge factor trying to rush down the board. This is the game for him. He needs to fight. He needs to come back in this game. Otherwise, he might not get another chance.
Impressive just to kind of do 20 moves like that. But it is very much like you've played it. The hand knows what it wants to do. There are other kind of situations which are so unusual that 5 moves in.
I think that's the case for Nepomniachtchi here, who's had this position before, but Magnus Carlsen, maybe less familiar. He doesn't have that muscle memory in this exact position. That's why he spent so much time on the clock.
I think I was told that it took someone 3 months to fully memorise one opening.
That's right. So maybe if we bring up the analysis board, we can explain Magnus Carlsen's last move especially. Surprises me a bit. We see that white's bishop has just moved... White's bishop has just moved up the board two squares. He wants to support his central pawn. So white, his whole idea is to push in the centre. Meanwhile, we see it's a race. Normally, we see pawn races in the endgame, but here we see a race already. It's getting exciting. Black is pushing.
And look at the bar.
The bar is zooming up in black's direction. This pawn on the left side, it's already only 3 squares from making a new queen. Meanwhile, white is pushing in the centre. White's pawn is also 3 squares from making a new queen. It's a race. Which pawn is stronger on the left, the pawn on the left flank, or the pawn in the centre? Black retreats his queen out of the way of this pawn. This pawn is nearly running home already. White just pushes his queen forward. It's a race.
Oh, and it's moved one step further. So this is such an intriguing battle, because one of the great things about having a pawn like that on the edge of the board is that it will decoy a lot of white's pieces, and I just really like what Magnus is doing. He's just calmly centralising his rooks and attacking the queen. And Magnus is going to try to use all his pieces to support the advance of his pawn in the centre.
Flank was so far down the board already, so close to making a new queen.
Oh, you can see the queen is now supporting that pawn. So that pawn is really ready to march 1 square forward and then make a queen. So Magnus has to tread carefully.
is looking a little bit worse.
Yeah, he's looking worse on the board, and also maybe affected by that disconnection earlier, those internet issues. His time situation, he has only 4 minutes in a bad position. There we see he shuffled his rook across to the corner. His rook has come back from where it came from. His rook started on that square, but it has to stop the black pawn. He's targeting that pawn right now. That black pawn is defended by the black queen and the black rook behind it. Sooner or later, we will see another black pawn start to race down the board. Yeah, first, he develops a bishop.
Yeah, that's very nicely done. The bishop comes in to help the game.
The only reason he would be allowed to if he had agreed with the arbiter that he was allowed to.
That's right. I think Magnus Carlsen, he's not the kind who would complain about that. He wouldn't launch an appeal. It must have come down to the arbiter's decision. I think that pawn, there we see, it's at home now. It's on the B line. It is going to start running. OK, it doesn't yet. Nepomniachtchi tries to trade a pair of rooks. Less keen on that one, but I think Nepomniachtchi is still in complete control.
And apparently he was allowed to leave the room. He had gotten permission from the arbiter, so he is not in any way cheating or not in any way disqualified.
Excellent.
Yes. Good news.
Excellent
Good
news, because we really don't want to be losing a game like that.
Exactly. So, all right, well, there has been so much drama in this game, both chess-wise and other things happening. But now they are playing, and Jan Nepomniachtchi, what's happening?
That's right, and Black is offering a trade of queens right now. I think, Jovanka, you didn't like that last move by White, retreating a bishop to the back line. You don't want to retreat unless there's a clear reason. Magnus Carlsen attacking his opponent's queen. We see Magnus there just gesturing against the camera. He's so frustrated right now. Everything's turned against him in this game. His internet connection, the position, the clock. We see the queens have left the board. Black is still a pawn ahead, though, and it's an important pawn. It's that pawn on the left flank, that huge, really advanced pawn there for Black. That is going to decide the game. Yeah. White forced to retreat another bishop. Black's rook now lines itself up with those two bishops, those two white bishops under fire from the black rook. Black's in complete control. We see that by the bar as well. A 4-point advantage here for Black. It looks like he's leaving his pawn here, this very advanced, this powerful pawn, unprotected. But the problem is White's rook cannot move. It is tied down to this bishop.
Racking my brains, because you've got to find moves that are tricky as well. And Magnus Carlsen has found the best move, I think, just to advance his bishop and attack that all-important, dangerous pawn.
White is just running out of resources. All of his pawns. OK, we see a pawn has left the board.
And he's running out of time as well.
He is running out of time, and the position is not looking so hot. OK, so Magnus has moved his bishop to attack the rook, and the rook has moved to counterattack the bishop that White has on the dark squares.
We could see a trade of bishops here. This last move, very clever from Jan Nepomniachtchi. It looked like he was about to drop some points here, drop some material. Instead, his rook just steps back, counterattack. Now, two bishops are looking at each other as well. We see Magnus Carlsen capture this pawn, but I think Black can just simply trade bishops on this square and then capture a pawn with his other bishop. Black's bishop's in complete control. Black is also going to be a couple of pawns ahead. Magnus trying to stay in this game, just trying to survive as long as possible. We saw him save a losing position in the last game, but if Nepomniachtchi's careful, if he's accurate,
then it is easier. The margin for a draw becomes lower and lower for Magnus Carlsen.
No, completely agreed. He's going to be 2 pawns ahead. I think now is the important moment. He needs to... OK, he finds it. He captures a pawn in the centre with his bishop. White finally removes that far advanced pawn on the left flank there. But if we count the material left, Black is 2 pawns ahead. 2 pawns in the endgame is normally a decisive advantage. But Black has an extra pawn on both the right-hand side and the left side. Black now just bringing his king into the position. His advantage dropping slightly there. I think he had a stronger move, but Black is still in charge.
Mm-hmm. And he has gone under 5 and even 4 minutes on the clock, Jan Nepomniachtchi. You have said that is when the clocks start ringing and it starts to get very tense. Jan Nepomniachtchi is thinking about his next move. It is a pawn move.
And he has marched that pawn forward on the left-hand side of the board. It is going to inch ever closer to making itself a queen. The bishops have come off, and I do expect...
I think White needs to make sure that his rook is on a more active square. At the moment, it's not great. He needs to keep an eye on that black pawn on the left side there. And normally, rooks, they belong behind pawns, especially passed pawns which have no rival. I think this is the best way to stop Black's pawn. If you leave it one move, if you move your... Okay, he puts his rook in front instead. His rook is passively placed in front. And we see the engine. Stockfish doesn't like that move at all. That might be the losing mistake from Magnus Carlsen. His final chance was to put his rook behind instead of in front of the pawn.
No way. Exactly along the same lines as you, David. The rook behind the pawn, and now it's in front because it's passive. Because if you're ever going to save an endgame like this, when your material down, it's by having a really good rook. And if your rook is behind, well, is in front of that pawn, well, it's not very good. It's not very active, and this is worrying.
That's right, and there was a trap in that position. Magnus Carlsen couldn't have taken that pawn with his rook, because if the rooks get traded off the board, black will win.
Absolutely, Kaya. That's what I think as well. I really love what Nepomniachtchi is doing. He is going to be using teamwork. I mean, David said it earlier on, teamwork makes the dream work, and that is that is so super important in an endgame. So I fully expect to see that king, the black king, start marching its way to the left-hand side of the board. And if I lose one pawn, am I going to be in time? And this is the problem. OK, so actually we've seen that happen. OK, Nepomniachtchi has made a run for it with the king, and that king is going to be headed towards the left-hand side of the board to assist that pawn in promoting.
White would have to resign or give up immediately. If White captured this pawn with his rook, black could finish the game immediately by trading off the rooks. This rook is now pinned, we would say. White's rook cannot move because the king is behind it. The rooks would have to leave the board. And once the rooks leave the board, black is a pawn ahead. When you're a pawn ahead in king and pawn endgames, you are winning. This pawn is just going to run home or distract the white king. Also, if White had captured the pawn with his king, the same thing would happen. Black would drop the rook down and the rooks would trade, be exchanged, leaving the board, and black would win. Therefore, Magnus Carlsen doesn't take that pawn. He doesn't fall into the trap. He gives a check. Nepomniachtchi tries to trade rooks, but we see that Magnus, he just has to keep the rooks. He has to hope for the best now. I think he just has to pray. Nepomniachtchi defending his pawn with his rook there. Yeah, 2 extra pawns in rook endgames is normally enough to win.
And Magnus retreating with his rook.
I think Nepomniachtchi, he just needs to bring his king left. He's not rushing yet. He's just advancing his pawns on the right side. I think there was no reason not to bring his king to the left side right now. That being said, he's not rushing. That's a good thing.
That is a good thing, because there's a little motto where it says, hurry. No, it's a rush. No, hurry, don't rush.
To maintain a winning advantage. He doesn't find it.
Oh!
He doesn't play the best move there.
I'm not liking this move at all.
And Stockfish doesn't like that move. Magnus Carlsen was frowning as well. But Magnus Carlsen maybe not finding the best reply, giving the advantage back to black. We saw that White's rook is shuffling across one square. He's trying to jump up the board and give check with his rook. He wants to attack the black king, but I think he had a safer option. He could have just kept that pawn blockaded. Black's pawn's on the right side now. He's advanced them. They look good, but they're actually weak. So I think Nepomniachtchi's last few moves, the plan wasn't great. He should have rushed his king over to the left side. Nepomniachtchi was winning.
He also has a passed pawn in the equation. Oh, OK, so black has centralised the rook.
Nepomniachtchi, OK, actually, Magnus Carlsen pushes his rook all the way up the board. I was going to say Nepomniachtchi looking calm, just taking a sip of water there. Finally, Magnus Carlsen, we talked about rooks needing to be behind pawns and black's pawns, but maybe it's too late. Now black is the one pushing his rook forward to attack white's pawns. That pawn on the B line, once that pawn disappears...
Ooh.
Now,
the computer hates that move.
Yeah,
the bar says now it's a draw. What's happening?
Oh, look at that. And I look at that. Magnus doesn't even capture the pawn. Instead, he gives a little check to drive the king backwards. Oh, and I think Nepomniachtchi's blown it.
He has blown it. This position, Nepomniachtchi, he will still win one of White's pawns there, White's remaining pawn. Nepomniachtchi probably will win that one, but this position is actually a well-known draw. Black will be 2 pawns ahead, but those 2 pawns, they're not connected. They're not connected to each other. They're separated. This one, it is a draw, but White needs to know what he's doing.
All right, and Magnus is now thinking, and he makes this move. Is he doing the right move here?
That's right. He's going behind with his rook now to try and check that black king. Finally, Magnus Carlsen, he's got a position that he will have studied before. I can guarantee Magnus Carlsen studied this exact endgame before, with black having 2 extra pawns, but separated pawns. Basically, all he needs to do is make sure those pawns don't advance together.
And they're very dangerous when those pawns are far advanced up the board. Pawn that is in white's half of the board is very well guarded by the king, and I think Magnus has this completely under control. Unbelievable stuff, to be honest.
I've said it before today, and it's just not Jan Nepomniachtchi's day.
Yeah, that's right. Like,
It's looking that way.
Yeah.
everything was in his favour as well. Magnus got disconnected. Magnus was flustered. He couldn't focus. He was just angry with the position. Bad situation on the clock, bad situation on the board. He just let it be traded off. He's left himself with 2 pawns, but white's king will easily deal with those pawns. Yeah, this is very, very surprising stuff. Nepomniachtchi, he will be able to advance another pawn here. We see him push a pawn. The problem is now there's just no way of making progress. He has to give up 1 pawn to get the other one running. But 1 pawn in a rook endgame is not enough.
The rook needs to mobilise itself. But, okay, the rook has mobilised in this case, and Magnus will take off that pawn. And now, okay, so we are going to see a lovely technique by Magnus Carlsen. So I suspect that his rook will now get excellent shots, and he hasn't been able to put the ball in the net.
That's right, twice in a row. And we see Magnus Carlsen just repeating the position there. He's going to use his rook to start checking the black king sooner or later. This is a very well-known draw. Black only has 1 pawn left, and that pawn will not be allowed to advance the whole way. White's just going to keep giving checks. Sometimes he can even offer to trade rooks white now, because 1 pawn on its own isn't enough.
So Nepomniachtchi is trying hard by advancing this king, but notice how Magnus Carlsen is using his king and his rook to stop that pawn advancing. Remember, in endgames, it is David Howell's favourite expression, teamwork makes the dream work, and you have to remember that.
That's right, and both white's rook and king covering the same square, covering the pawn advance. Nepomniachtchi there just shuffling his rook across. That move actually doesn't do anything. It's a waiting move.
And now the white rook has come to gobble up the white pawn, and we are going to see, I think the players agree, a very quick draw.
That's right. Nepomniachtchi, you can tell on his face.
Yep.
He knows it's over. He's laughing to himself. He's missed another opportunity. 2nd game in a row. He had it in the bag. Just nerves, the clock, everything just made him...
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Panic.